Buenos días, estimados colegas y compañeros. Hoy vamos a conocer a un fotógrafo importante, un tipo que hace un trabajo realmente brillantísimo. Él es americano-polaco o polaco-americano, que dirían sus padres. Entonces, él desde pequeño ha estado criado en Estados Unidos, habla polaco y su cultura es una mezcla entre América y Europa. Con lo cual, pues eso enriquece en cierta medida el trabajo expresivo que tiene este artista, ¿no? Bueno, él va a hablar en inglés, con lo cual tenéis que marcar aquí la ruedecita para traducir al español, al polaco, al ruso o a la lengua que elijáis y que necesitéis. Entonces, lo curioso de este hombre, de este artista, es que él vive en Tokio. Y bueno, él se dedica a dar clases de fotografía allí y vamos a conocer parte de su trabajo. Él es un fotógrafo de calle y de arquitectura. Es un excelente fotógrafo callejero y un excelente fotógrafo de arquitectura. Y vamos a entrar en su pequeño apartamento de Tokio y a conocer a este artista. Su nombre es Lukasz Palka. Vámonos a Tokio.
So I was born in Poland, and my dad was a photographer. And well, he wasn't a professional. I mean, he just liked photography, and he had this old camera called a Praktika, which was an East German camera, right? And what should I say about it? So yeah, it was a film camera. I mean, I didn't never really use this camera, but I always thought it was a cool little thing, and so I had kind of a fascination, I guess, with cameras and photography and things like that. But I didn't really start doing it until much later. And then I always liked visual arts. So I used to, well, like a lot of kids, right? I used to draw. And then when computers became a thing, I used to do a lot of digital art, like a kind of like a 3D stuff, but I wasn't very good at it. I was just playing around and creating, fun images. And one of the things I liked to do was take pictures with, at that time, we had a cheap, not the one my dad had, his old one, but just some like typical, cheap film camera. I don't remember what it was, a Kodak something. But this wasn't serious. So these are like the very, very early days. So that's kind of my initial kind of exposure to photography. So it wasn't really until I came to Japan that I became interested in photography. And then I went to Tokyo after the US because when I was in the university in America, what do you call that? I studied literature, English literature and writing. So I wanted to be a writer or a journalist when I was in university. But on the side, I took Japanese lessons. So I had a course for Japanese, just for fun. And my professor in university, he or she, I should say, she told me that we could study abroad. We could study in Japan if we wanted to, because my school, my university, and the Japanese university had an exchange program. And it's interesting why. Actually, I went to a Jesuit university called Marquette in Milwaukee, and so the Jesuits, they're missionaries, right? So they have universities all over the world, and they have a university in Japan, in Tokyo. It's called Sophia University. in Japanese called jochi, but it means the same thing. Sophia means wisdom or knowledge, right? So it's the same name in both languages. And so I just did that. I thought that's cool. I'll go do the exchange. I did 4 months in Tokyo. And honestly, my studies were poor because I was spending too much time, enjoying life in Japan, exploring and stuff. But I took Japanese lessons. I studied Japanese literature. I took a very difficult class about Buddhist philosophy, which I did very poorly in. But I did learn a few things. I got bad grades, but I learned. It was valuable for me. So I had this nice exposure to Japanese culture. And then I went back to America to finish university because this was just an exchange. And after a year and a half in the US, I thought, what am I going to do with my life? And I studied literature and writing, and I wanted to be some kind of journalist or something. But I fell in love with Japan. So I came to Japan to teach English. So I just got a job as an English teacher. So for me, my daily life here is, I would say, unique amongst photographers because I do photography, of course, that's what I do. But a big part of what I do in terms of photography is actually teach photography. And I should say that when I was an English teacher, I enjoyed teaching. I didn't enjoy teaching English so much because it's kind of not a very fascinating subject, but I like teaching people. So in 2015, me and this other guy named Axel Derube, he's a French guy, we met around that time, and he was just in the beginnings of starting a business about doing photography workshops, very early stages. And he asked me, he said, he liked my work, my photos, and he said, hey, why don't you join and we're going to run this business together. So that's, there's a long story there, but that's basically how that happened. And so in 2015, we started a company called I Explore, and it's about teaching people photography. So people from all over the world who come to Japan, of course, people who live here can be our customers too. But we mostly get people from abroad. So of course these days we have 0 customers. So I also freelance as a photographer, which is the typical thing. So I do all kinds of photography for clients, like typical stuff. But for the last 5 years, a big part of what I was doing was these photography workshops. And the way we do them, they're about from about 2 hours to 6 hours. And we go out together around the city, and I teach about street photography and architecture, basically anything you can do in the city, like urban photography, and a little bit of portraiture. For example, we go to Kyoto, and in Kyoto we teach, we hire a geisha, and we do portrait work with a geisha. So we do stuff like that as well. So kind of cultural Japanese themes, but also urban photography. But my favorite thing is street photography, architecture, urban stuff like that. My number one photographer, I would say, in all of them would be Saul Leiter. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's okay, great, yeah. So he's a very, very renowned street photographer. He kind of became quite famous over the last 10 years. I've been to of his exhibitions, of course, posthumously because he passed away in 2013. But in the last few years, I've been to 2 of his exhibitions here in Tokyo, and they were amazing, very, very impressive. I was already familiar with his work, but when you see it in person, it's of course even better. And then the second exhibition was really cool because it had a lot of work that I never seen before. So he would be probably my biggest inspiration. I shoot photos very differently from him. Like if you look at my photos and his photos, they're not the same. But I do feel that I've gotten a lot of ideas from like the DNA of his photography that I can put into, little bits of things that I can put into my work. And so, yeah, I really, really like his work. Another one would be Alex Webb. I'm a big fan of his work as well. Very different. By the way, all of the ones I'm going to say are in color because I shoot in color and I love color street photography. Black and white is great too. I do have some that I like in black and white, but the color ones are the ones that really inspire me. So Alex Webb is a big one. His ability to layer so many different things into one photo is just incredible. And although I'm inspired by that, I haven't been able to use that in my work as much because I find it very challenging, but it's very cool. Another one that I like that's contemporary is Siegfried Hansen. He's a German photographer. We've actually met. We kind of imported him once as part of I Explore. 3 years ago now, we brought him over to Japan and we kind of organized the workshop that he ran. So we sort of like sponsored it, I guess. And we had a couple of our regular customers that I explore join his workshop for about 2 days. And of course, I followed along too. I wasn't the client, so he was focusing on our customers, but I was sort of there observing. And so it was fascinating to watch him work, and I learned a few things there as well. His style is very, I'm going to say, very German, because it's a lot of geometry, straight lines, sharp colors, but he's amazing. His work is fantastic. And also, of course, in color, and so I'm a big fan of his as well. And there's one more I'm going to mention in terms of like photographers that influenced me. I'll mention two more. I'll mention one more that I love, and I'll mention a Japanese one because I should, since I'm in Japan. And the other one is William Eggleston, who is, you know, a very, very well-known photographer. And what I love about his work, and I do it all the time in my work as well, is he shoots, as he puts it himself, like the mundane things. So he would shoot, you know, just behind a restaurant, just like a dumpster and a car, like very basic, simple stuff. But the way he shot it was so beautiful, and of course in color. And so I shoot a lot of those things too, just random scenes with no people, which some people would say this is not exactly street photography, and I'm okay with that. I don't care about labels. I photograph people, and I also photograph like William Eggleston style scenes of just nothing, and that's great. So that's what I love about his work. And the last one I'll say is Shin Noguchi. He's a Japanese street photographer. I think he's actually a Magnum photographer these days, so cool for him. So he's, you know, well renowned. I'm not 100% sure on that. I think he is, but he shoots in color as well, and he shoots these very beautiful like daily life scenes in Japan, a little bit surreal, not really, but they're kind of, you know, a little bit weird. When you look at the photos, the scenes are sort of, you know, in that typical street photography sense, sort of surreal. He has this great series of photos of people carrying things, random things. So just each photo, somebody's carrying something. And I love that series because they have this otherworldly sort of look to them. So yeah, some of the, and there are countless others, photographers who are my favorites, but I would say those five are probably the, like, you know, high up there. And I've taken a lot of inspiration from all of them. Okay, so that's in the beginning. Photography for me was about getting out of the house. That simple, because I came here, I spent a couple of months, almost a year living in Tokyo, and I realized, I mean, I did have a camera, I had like a little point and shoot, but I wasn't really going out. I would just go out with my friends and have a drink and then go home and just do the same kind of life that I was living in America, which is, you know, watch TV or something, you know, just the basic stuff. And I realized I'm missing the purpose that I'm here is to get to know this country. So I need to get out there. So I bought a nicer camera, like an SLR, and I thought I'm going to use this to get me out of the house. So initially it was just a way to go explore the world. And then I fell in love with it. So I wanted it to be a career. So I started to shoot more like, okay, can I do portraits? I was trying to figure out how I can make money from photography. And I kind of lost sight of that initial purpose. And so it's gone full circle, where these days for me, my main goal when I'm out doing photography around the city is a kind of meditation. So I try to be very mindful about my surroundings. And the purpose of shooting is to, when I just see the world, I just kind of try to accept that as this is. So my artistic thought, to answer that question directly, is whatever I see, I just want to save my perspective of it, right? So the way I see it, I want to try to preserve that so I can see it myself again later, and of course share it with everybody else by publishing my work online and etc. But that's very broad. That's kind of my approach. More specifically, I do have a couple of ways that I shoot the city, different angles that from which I approach it, which tell different stories. So, for example, I shoot one series that I like to call Noctopolis, which literally means like night city, and it's about, it's actually a little bit complex, and eventually I want to publish this into a book, so I'm spoiling the concept, but I'll tell you anyway. Basically, it's the idea is that when me as a photographer and as a foreigner here, right, an outsider of the culture in the city, when I'm exploring it, there's a couple of different stages that you go through, or at least I did. First, there's this fascination with the energy of the city. Everything is so chaotic and intense and colorful. But then there's also this sense, a little bit of like alienation, where, not in such a bad way, but just there is, where I'm the outsider looking in. So a lot of these photos are like through windows and through glass and, you know, separated from the life of the people that, you know, they're doing their thing here. And that's where the Saul Leiter inspiration comes in, by the way, because a lot of his photos are like through glass and through these kinds of things. So I kind of use that. And then lastly is I do a lot of, and this is part of the same series, but kind of a different series. I do a lot of rooftop exploration where I try to go up high above, you know, into places where people don't usually go to get interesting views of the city from this outside perspective. And what I feel when I'm doing those kind of photos is a great sense of solitude where I can sort of be on my own. Again, it goes back to this meditative idea, but I'm very much separated from the city because I'm high up on a roof and there's nobody else there and I can hear the city far off in the distance below. So these photos together create this kind of story which is still forming in my mind. So that's one aspect. But then there are other series that I do. I have one that I call Vaporized Memories, which is these very colorful photos of like a gradient in the sky and silhouettes of buildings. And for these, what I'm thinking of is this sense of nostalgia where, because Tokyo is this kind of strangely futuristic, but also not futuristic city. So people who haven't been here imagine it's very futuristic, and it is in some ways, but you realize that actually it's not. A lot of stuff is very old. And a lot of things that the way people do things here are kind of old, like they still use fax machines and stuff like this, right? That's the joke. But the point is that I imagine that in like the 70s or 60s, you know, people imagined a future for what 2020, for example, would be like like the 21st century. But actually, it's not quite like that. So that series of photos to me is like a sense of nostalgia for a future that never actually came to exist, right? And that's kind of one way that I see the city, is how it transformed over the years, but it transformed in a direction that people didn't expect. It went in a direction that wasn't quite as futuristic as maybe we imagined 50 years ago. I wasn't around 50 years ago, but you see all that media from those days, right? The way people thought of the future. And finally, I do just photograph like life in Japan. So I have a lot of photos of people praying at shrines or, you know, doing sumo. I have some photos from sumo that I took, you know, festivals. So I do take on this more documentarian style approach. So all in together, it's a very long answer, but all together, I shoot the city and Tokyo and then Japan in general from a bunch of different perspectives where I'm trying to tell different stories. But everything is always about the city and mostly Tokyo. I go to other cities too, but it's mostly Tokyo. I'm very much in love with this city. So my artistic thoughts are very complicated because there's a lot of different ways that I shoot things. But they all boil down to that, where I just try, the first thing that I said, it's a mindful approach to just seeing what's there and then interpreting it in my way and just trying to accept it as it is without too much, I like forcing a certain narrative. Yeah, all of these narratives I just told you, they came up through just photographing. I didn't have a preconception. It's just someday this idea came up or this idea came up. And then when I look back through my work, thousands of photos, I started to see patterns and realize, oh, cool, I have this story. And then I have this other story. And so that's how I approach my photography. So the next project, there are two. One is that I would like to do an exhibition, because honestly, I've never really done a proper exhibition, because I'm very much like I don't want to make it sound like it's better than it is, but it's like a monk, kind of like a Zen monk, you know. I just want to shoot, so I don't think so much about publishing my work. So I put it online on Instagram because it's really easy and fast, so I don't have to think much about it. But an exhibition takes a lot of planning, a lot of effort, and I've been, you know, encouraged by friends and family over the years many times. Why don't you do an exhibition? You should do an exhibition. And I always felt not really ready, because I didn't feel that I had a good enough body of work, which is probably a terrible excuse, because you should just do an exhibition with whatever you have, and then you can always do another exhibition. But now I really do feel like I'm finally ready to have an exhibition, and you know, it's the next thing I'm kind of planning. So like, what photos am I going to do? What photos will I include, and then how can I exhibit them? So that's the smaller project. And then the bigger project is the book that I just mentioned. So I would like to publish a book based on my night photos around Tokyo that tell that story that I just kind of summarized for you guys very briefly. The nice thing is I have started printing my work finally last year. I found a really nice print shop here in Tokyo, very nice people. They're of course Japanese, but they speak some English, so I can communicate with them. I can communicate in Japanese too, but it's good that they speak English. And finally I started to print my work, and finally I at least started selling prints on my website. So prints are available. And I didn't want to go the route. A lot of photographers sell prints through like some online print service where you could just, like on-demand printing. And I didn't want to do that because I want to sign each print, and I want it to be like an artifact that I created. So through this printing shop, I print my photos, and people can buy them. But very luckily, last time I was there to pick up prints, I met a man a Japanese guy who is opening up an art gallery here in Tokyo, and he saw one of my prints that was there that I was picking up, and he was excited, and he invited me to say, hey, when I open my gallery this summer, come over, and we'll talk about maybe an exhibition. So I have a nice chance, a very, very lucky chance. And so for me, of course, if they happen, I'm going to go to those areas and I'm going to see what it's like. I'm going to try to photograph some things. Maybe I can come up with some sort of a project or story based around that, because it is 2 weeks long. So there should be plenty of time to come up with some sort of a work. I will say, though, that I think a lot of people will be photographing them. And I always kind of go for sort of esoteric things that kind of do my own thing. But I'm definitely interested. So I'll probably be around I'll go to the stadium and whatnot. I probably won't be like in the audience, and I don't think I'll be doing like the typical sports photography. I'll probably try to shoot it from some other angle where it's more like street photography kind of thing, like a more candid sort of approach. But it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me and interviewing me. It's always a pleasure to talk about my work. I appreciate it as well. Thank you. Yes, hats off to you as well.